Thank you so much for braving. This has almost become a cliche line in Bangalore, no? For braving the Bangalore traffic and coming here on a Thursday evening. Because when I read this book, Memories in the Service of Hindu Nation, I felt we were onto something here. The subtext of the title is The Afterlife of Partition in India. And that held my attention because, frankly, living in Bangalore, those who are Kannadigas or those who are from South India would have a sense of their culture, their being, their history and all that. And you would notice that North India is very different from South India, But we in North India have been hearing everything that is in this book in whispers, in talks in drawing rooms. But now, of course, all of that has become, on loudspeakers. So I thought you'll get an insight into what Pranav, who I thought is doing an excellent job by questioning what this talk was about for 50 years almost, till we now have a new way of looking at the country itself. I want to add two caveats before I start, and that's, I think, very important. When we talk of partition to this evening, we are going to refer to North India, especially Delhi, and a little bit of Punjab. But please know, we fully acknowledge Bengal's partition and wonder if anyone can guide us to a similar book from Bengal's side, from that border as well. Sashwati, I'll come to you for help. And for audience who belongs to North India, the stories of partition are intimate, immediate, and absolute familial truths. We recognize that and we respect that. Nothing that we say here this evening takes away anything from that. But this evening we want to unveil a different mirror. A mirror of reflection, of introspection, from which we can understand how our memories have ended up serving a very, very, to my mind, dubious political purpose. I'll let Pranav come in, but let me add these 2-3 lines because I don't know where I can add them in questions. What I liked about this book is that he's writing from inside outside. We will ask him about how this idea came about, how the book came about. But it is interrogating a particular community outside Delhi and in Dehradun and some other places, which belong to his class and caste in society. Why that happened, we will explore that. But from inside, he's talking outwards to the bigger world, which I liked very much, because normally the gaze is always from outside to inside. So he is reversing that gaze. What I liked very much about the book is that we novelists, when I'm writing my novels or stories, I love this unreliable narrator, because to me that is the way the reader gets into the story, Here I'm seeing an academic book using a technique of bringing in the reader into the book. It is not talking down to us when you read it. In fact, it's very conversational to some extent. I wonder, it's a compliment. It's not an academic book. It is an academic book. It's published by Cambridge Press. And because it is academic, based on fieldwork, there are 3 strands in it: experience from actual fieldwork, reading and views of various previous scholars, almost everybody I know in the firmament, and the idea the book proposes itself. Since we are talking in this space and not an academic space, Giri, please call him to Azim Premji. He can come there and talk in an academic way. We shall focus on 1 and 3. We shall focus on experience of actual fieldwork and the idea that the book proposes. We are not going to touch upon something he has done very brilliantly. Tell us what other academics think, historians, sociologists, anthropologists, what they think. But then he doesn't dwell on that. He takes that point, either rebukes it, refutes it, or agrees to it. So this book's juxtaposition with scholars would make for a different talk, I think. So Pranav, let's come to it. What does it mean to remember the partition in time of fascism? No, that's not a question. That's the theme of our evening. Because we are in Bangalore, I want to ask you, why are we doing this event today? Not over the weekend. Why have we chosen a Thursday for it?
So we're doing this on the 17th of August because that is the day on which the Radcliffe Line became public. And that is the day on which the partition became a reality to people in Punjab and along that line. So this is the anniversary of a very dark day in our history. So to do it on this day is something that has a lot of emotional resonance.
When did migration start?
See, that's a really...
We are doing this so that you get a sense of, South India doesn't know partition really, so, yeah.
So that question depends on whom you pose it to. So, for example, the community of Bannuwal refugees, people from the Northwest Frontier Province that I spent a lot of time with in Faridabad, for them, their first encounter, their community's first encounter with the colonial border was actually when the Durand Line became a reality. That's the border between the Northwest Frontier Province and Afghanistan. That was their first experience of a colonial border. And the people...
Which year?
So that was, I think, 1899. So it's a very interesting memory because they were teenagers at the time of the partition. But they remember hearing about the establishment of this hard border from their grandparents. So for them, the colonial borders that sort of impinge on their life actually begins with the Durand Line.
Right.
But to come back to the heart of your question, I think migration begins as a trickle to around the late 1930s. And then it picks up massively around 1946. The Direct Action Day, as we've talked about earlier, was a kind of major catalyst. And then when you come to 1947, and what happens in March in Punjab is that there was a massive, there were massive riots across Punjab. And that contributed to the migration of a lot of people. And a lot of people who migrated in March 1947 thought they were doing it temporarily. They thought they were just, a lot of them actually came to Delhi, thought they were just going to wait this out and then go back when things calm down. And then things just never calmed down. My family came on the 12th of August, 1947. And again, they thought this was a temporary thing. So they thought they would come here, they would stay in Delhi for a bit. They stayed at a relative's house at first. And they thought things will calm down, we'll go back. Because transfer of population, that doesn't happen, right? I mean, who's ever heard of a transfer of population? But they never went back. And of course, the migration has continued in some ways, even after the partition. So in Faridabad itself, I met a couple of Afghan refugees who'd migrated to Faridabad in the 1980s and the 90s. In the 80s, the reason for that wave was when the Soviets invaded Afghanistan and things got really bad. And the 90s, because that's when the Taliban took over. And so it became really hard for them to stay there as minorities.
What was the permit system? It comes up in the 9th chapter.
Yeah.
What was it?
What permit system are you actually talking about?
India issuing a permit that you can be here, you cannot be here. There is a mention to that in the...
Are you talking about the visa thing for Gangaram, my informant?
Yeah.
So this is really interesting. So when you get a visa for Pakistan today, you have to say which 5 cities you're going to visit, and you can only visit those 5 cities. So you have to actually say, I'm going to go to Miawali, Islamabad, Lahore, etc., etc. And if you're actually caught violating this, you can be deported, and you will be blacklisted. You'll never be allowed back into Pakistan.
When we think of partition, I mean, like normally uh, it's painted as this greatest exile that happened across borders. That's the normal rhetoric around it. But for somebody who doesn't know it, will start thinking of other great catastrophes that have happened to human beings because of human beings, not nature, and not even a war in some ways. But the things that come to mind is the Holocaust or Cambodia or Vietnam and things. How do you think partition was different from these other? Because each tragedy is in itself has a personality of its own. So what do you think was the major difference between partition and all these others?
So, from a sociological, anthropological, historical point of view, there are a few things that make the partition kind of unique. Though I hate to kind of hierarchize things in that way. But anyway, one of the things that you have here is that partition as an event of genocide coincides with decolonization. And you have the setting up of a colonial border along religious lines and all of that. But what actually makes it very different from something like the Holocaust is the fact that the juxtaposition of victims and perpetrators is actually very complicated with the partition. So, for example, Hindus and Sikhs who were persecuted in Pakistan during the partition were victims of violence. And this has been documented in the historical record, often came to Delhi and then exacted revenge on the other side of the border from Muslims here. And so there was this retributive aspect to the violence of the partition, where people who had been driven out from one side of the border came to the other side and then felt like taking revenge. So that's one thing that makes it quite complicated. The other thing also is that, as Urvashi Batalia and Ritu Menon and Kamla Bhasin have shown, there's a gendered aspect to this as well, which is that we have this, we have the figure of the martyr woman, this idea that Hindu and Sikh women would rather jump in the well or commit suicide than avoid being captured, abducted, or raped by men of the other community. What their oral historical work has actually shown is that these women did not go to their deaths voluntarily. These deaths were often a result of coercion. That it was actually a kind of honor killing.
And patriarchy.
And patriarchy. So that complicates the whole victim-perpetrator thing a lot more, because the very people who, the very community that is on one side, the victim, could have well been perpetrators of gendered violence within their own communities. And that is actually what makes remembering the partition incredibly tricky. It makes talking about trauma and victimhood incredibly tricky.
So how did the project evolve from, first how did you zero down on this as the idea for a PhD, and then make the PhD into a book, and then lose 50,000 words in the process? So what happened?
So the funny thing is, it actually doesn't begin as a PhD project. It begins as a master's dissertation. So in 2014, when I went to Ireland to do my master's in sociology, my flatmate, and this was by pure chance, my flatmate in the university ended up being a Pakistani student called Adin, and it's incredible. Like, living with him and making friends with other Pakistani students on campus was a really eye-opening experience, because all my life until then, I'd heard that these people are incredibly different. This is the enemy nation. And you meet them and you realize they are more like you than anyone else outside your own country. So, the first day that Adin moved into the apartment, I wasn't at home at the time. But he moved in, he opened the fridge, and he saw a box of, he saw a plastic Tupperware box filled with basmati rice sitting in the fridge. And he goes, there's definitely a Desi person living here. And it's those little things, like whenever we'd exchange food, we'd never send the dabba back empty. You always put something in it. And it's those little things that tell you how alike we are. So that was a big catalyst in terms of thinking about what does this border actually mean. And it was then that I think the stories that I'd heard from my grandparents that we'd come from across the border actually became relevant. I knew we'd come from across the border, but how and why and what was that experience like? So I did a limited oral history for my master's dissertation. And the 3 weeks that I spent in Delhi doing my fieldwork, I actually ended up meeting a large community of partition survivors. Too many, in fact, for me to interview for a master's dissertation. So that's when I decided that there was a lot more going on here and that I had to come back. So I did for my PhD.
And then to Cambridge?
So when I was done with my fieldwork and I sat down to write this, in the back of my mind I knew I was always writing a book. I didn't want to write a typical academic dissertation. And that's also partly a freedom that I had being in an anthropology department, because anthropologists love creative writing. Anthropologists write differently from sociologists and historians. We are part of the stories that we tell. And our research projects are very narrative driven. So I always knew that what I was writing when I was writing my thesis would or might someday become a book. But I think it really started to become an actual tangible thing after I passed my Viva. And I passed with no corrections. And my external examiner was Peter van der Veer, who also became one of the endorsers for the book. And he said, you have to publish this. So that's when I started contacting publishers, and I spoke to a guy in Sage. And when he heard about the length of the thesis, he was like, this is far too long. No one's going to touch this. Because it was 175,000 words. So no one's going to touch this. If you want to have any chance of publishing this, you need to bring it down to at least somewhere south of 130.
That I find is so vague. I mean, my book is 225,000 words. I mean, nobody told me that. Of course, they sniped off 80,000 words from that also, but I think there's just vague ways in which academic publishers behave with students.
Yeah. It's the standard monograph length. So, this kind of a book is called a monograph.
But if you have something important to say, you take no more time and say it.
That's the argument I made in my thesis, and I got away with it.
Okay, let's come down to the actual acknowledgement of the book, in which I found this term which I have never seen in any written work like this. You call your subjects or your respondents as informants. Now, informants is a term from intelligence or from policing, Why are you doing it in the anthropology here?
It's actually a standard practice in anthropological texts.
Really?
And there's a reason for it. So we've kind of moved on from calling the people that we work with in the field, and make a note, I'm saying people that we work with, not people that we study, people that we work with in the field, as informants, because it is an acknowledgement of the fact that we meet as equals, and they are like our informers on the social phenomena that we are studying. So we've moved on from calling people participants or respondents or subjects. Because
I don't like informants either. I mean, it has a different connotation altogether. You need to have a new word.
No, I think it works, and it's a way of getting around the objectification that words like participant and subject actually imply. There's a hierarchization as well, right? Because you, as a researcher, are positioning yourself above them and saying, I'm the one that studies you.
But here it sounds like a spy or a mole or this thing like that.
That's also...
He's going to leak something out to me, some
It's also an ironic play on the fact that a lot of anthropologists through the last sort of 20, 30 years have also been mistaken for spies by authoritarian governments, because what we do in the field looks a lot like spying to the state, right? Because what do? We meet people, we make notes, we record things, we take photographs, we ask questions about everything, we want to meet everyone. We're not averse to meeting people who might be called politically radical, right? So in that sense, maybe we are spies, but we are spies of social phenomena.
You're spies in the service of academia.
Yeah. There you go.
So this is about methodology. There were two big things that stood up for me in the methodology. One is drinking copious amounts of tea. but you just actually explained methodology a little more to me now, And second is this snowballing way of finding your informants. Would you want to tell about that?
So when you're conducting research with a closed community like this, and what I mean by a closed community is that there's no mailing list that I can find. It's not like Bangalore International Center where I can just email Lekha and be like, can I have the mailing list so I can contact everyone? You don't have that with something like this, with partition survivors. So how do you find them? I had an advantage here in that the elders in my family actually know a lot of people who've come from the other side. And so even before I'd landed in Delhi, and this was my master's dissertation, I already had a notion of 5 or 6 people that I knew I could interview. And from there then, everyone that I meet, I'd kind of go, do you know anyone else who's around this age, who's come from Pakistan, who might remember the partition, who might want to talk to me? And more often than not, everyone's just happy to make introductions. And so that's how you snowball. You kind of move within the network by meeting people. And it's very sort of interpersonal and personality driven.
But it also limits you that you are then talking to more of the same kind of people, whether they are the same class or the same caste also many times. And often gender comes to play a big role here because at least as a male researcher, I find it very difficult to find women to talk to. That's like a personal thing. And working on Punjab, and that's the only criticism I hear about the book. There are not enough women's stories in it. I mean, like, they're not talking to me. What do I do? But did you also face such a thing?
So first about caste and then about gender, okay? So about caste. Yes, absolutely. It is a limitation, caste and class, because generally if you're snowballing through a community, through people's personal networks, you will meet people who are of the same social status, because that is just a fact of life. But that's only a problem if you don't acknowledge it and reflect on how the stories that they're telling you are a product of their positionality in society. That these are the narratives of upper caste, Hindu, middle class people. It's only a problem if you don't reflect on that bias. And in fact, I think it's a strength of my book that I actually turn that gaze inward. And I then analyze the positionality of these narratives.
No, I mean, he does it very well. It will come up in another answer later on, but I think the juxtaposition of the class and caste he's talking to with others who are, I hate using this word, it will also come up in a question, but there is a certain privilege to the kind of informants he was talking to, but he juxtaposes it with those who did not have that advantage.
We forgot about gender. Can I?
Yeah.
So gender as well. Gender is really interesting here because there's a lot of misogyny in these communities in the sense that male informants, I found, were more often than not reluctant to introduce me to female relatives and female friends who were also partition survivors because they were like, she's a woman, she doesn't know about politics, what will she tell you about the partition? It's very blatant misogyny. Fortunately, I had my grandmother and my grandaunt helping me. So they were able to introduce me to women in the community. And again, snowballing helps there.
Dr. Jain is here, his excellent book on the psychological view on partition. And there's an essay there by Tarun Saint, which struck me personally because he says that much of the partition literature that we have read in the last 50, 70 years, it actually re-emphasizes our trauma regarding partition, So you say that good ethnography values listening. Listening is one of the most important aspects. But then you say, but you almost perhaps invented the hermeneutics of suspicion to the narratives that you were hearing. And you actually anchor all your work in that hermeneutics. Would you like to expand on it? Maybe you didn't invent it, it's part of the tradition, but the way you did not take the narratives you were getting just for what they were, but you started questioning where they were coming from and how they were formed. That's a critical part of the book.
So first let's begin at the bottom, what is ethnography, right? Ethnography, in its simplest sense, is both a style of writing and a methodology. It's a relational practice. And what we mean by that is that it's a way of studying social relations by being part of them. But it is also a relational practice in the sense that what we consider a written ethnography, this, for example, is produced through the relationship between the stories that you've gathered in the field and the analysis that you, and the way in which you analyze them. There's a relationality there. How you connect the stories that you've gathered with theory and sort of present it in this kind of an account. Listening is sort of the most fundamental part of this. You can't have ethnography if you're not listening. But it also works in another way, which is that most anthropological projects are open-ended. We don't go in with a theoretical framework decided from the beginning. We have a notion of the things that we want to talk about. But the way in which we want to write them up is ultimately determined by the stories that we gather and the things that seem important to the people that we are speaking. So that is how I arrive at theodicy, which is this idea of how do people rationalize death and suffering? How do they make sense of something as monumental and senseless as the partition? That is a question that actually comes out from these narratives. And then I write about it.
Expand on theodicy.
Right. I think I want to read a small section. Sorry, I'm not used to speaking into a mic, so I keep sort of putting my hand away. I'll try to be better at this.
Want me to hold it for you?
No, it's fine. Right. So if anyone's reading along with me, this is on page 15, and the background to this is that theodicy, like I said, it comes from Weberian sociology, and it refers to the way in which human beings rationalize experiences of death and suffering and misfortune and disappointment. Essentially, this idea of why did this happen to me? And my sort of inspiration for this was when my grand aunt died. So she was the youngest sister of my late grandmother, and she passed away in June 2018, so towards the end of my fieldwork. And it was a catalyst because going to her funeral and observing how people were talking about her after her death opened my eyes to the fact that there is a larger sociological process here, that people were constantly trying to analyze her life, understand why she died. We're very concerned with sort of presenting this as a good death, of saying that she lived a good life, she's at peace now. And there was a whole process of rationalization that was going on. But I had also already seen this with narratives of the partition. That this was so that kind of directed my attention to the fact that this was a larger sociological process. I could see it in this funeral, but I could also see it in a larger sense in the narratives of the partition. And so that's why I want to read this little bit. It's just about a page from my book, which kind of frames theodicy and why I got into this with the larger focus of my book. So anyway, page 15, the last paragraph, it goes, "It was this intimate experience of death that brought my attention to the problem of theodicy in the context of the partition. As South Asia moves towards a time when the partition passes from living memory to an archived history, the ensuing transition has given way to a boom of oral history. Starting from 1998, the last 25 years have seen the growth of a wave of oral historical work on the partition, one that has included the establishment of online oral history archives, such as the 1947 Partition Archive, and even a partition museum in Amritsar. Just as Nani Masi's death led to a flood of memory, the inevitable death of the last generation of partition survivors has similarly led to a wave of remembrance. In this idea that the death of memory evokes remembrance lies the implicit glimmer of French historian Pierre Nora. Writing in the 1990s, Nora famously declared the death of memory, stating, and I quote, "Memory is constantly on our lips because it no longer exists," end quote. Nora's pronouncement of the extinction of milieu of memory, environments where memory forms a meaningful part of everyday life, was accompanied unrelatedly by Francis Fukuyama in 1992, who that very year proclaimed the end of history itself. Fukuyama was triumphant in his declaration, while Nora lamented, prematurely, the obliteration of memory by the seemingly all-consuming tides of history. Read in 2023, these proclamations of the death of things, seem less like insights on memory and history and more a reflection of the strangely dislocating global transformations of that time. The collapse of the Soviet Union, and with it the end of the Cold War, inaugurated a new world order almost overnight. These bold pronouncements seem to echo the dislocation produced by the swift collapse of political formations that had seemed as unshakable as memory and history themselves. In observing that the last 2 decades have produced a wave of oral history, I do not intend to proclaim the death or the end of anything. My point is entirely different. In pointing out that the inevitable death of the last generation of partition survivors has sparked a public turn to remembrance, I argue that the vast body of literature on the partition of India comprises a long, ongoing search for theodicy. Just as the flood of memory provoked by Nani Masi's death sought to reconcile her death with belief in a meaningful cosmos, or nomos, I'll explain that term later, so too successive waves of literature on the partition have sought to reconcile its death and suffering with the nomos that is the idea of India. Having delineated this theodicical arc of partition studies, I then position my own ethnography in relation to it. I argue that Hindu nationalism serves as a form of theodicy for my Hindu upper caste informant's experience of the death and suffering of the partition, transcending the uselessness of their suffering. Through its nationalist idioms of sacrifice and martyrdom, Hindu nationalism helps rationalize death and suffering. So the larger point here is that in sociology and anthropology, when we talk about death, there are 2 terms we use. There's good deaths and bad deaths. Society hates bad deaths. What is bad death? Bad death is not just a death that is untimely or violent or gruesome, but it is also, in a sociological sense, a death that goes unmourned. It's very important for us. You see, funerals are for the living. It's very important for us to give a nice send-off to our loved ones that die. This is important to humans. It has always been. That's why we have such elaborate funerary rituals. On the other hand, a good death is a death which is not just a celebration of this person's life, but is a reminder that this person was loved, they lived a good life, they were a nice and a kind person, and that they're missed now that they're gone. What I'm trying to argue here is that there are 2 things happening with these memories of the partition of India. One is that, on the one hand, to its survivors, the partition fundamentally does not make sense. It's a gaping void. And when you dig deeper in these narratives, you always come up with this question of, why did this have to happen to us? And memory, by definition, is a process of interpreting the past. When we remember, we try to make sense of the past. And when partition survivors remember the partition, they are struggling to make sense of this barbaric event. And that's where theodicy comes in. So when I talk about theodicy, what I'm doing is turning our attention to the ways in which people struggle to make meanings out of an incredibly difficult and traumatic experience. And what I found in my research was that Hindu nationalism functions as a way of giving meaning to this experience, because it's got a whole gloss on history now. It removes this gaping, or at least it seems to address the gaping void at the heart of these narratives, which is why did this happen? And the answer that Hindu nationalism gives, and it's a very easy answer, is that this is part of 1,000 years of history of enslavement and invasion and subjugation, and the effect that has is that partition survivors remember the the victims of the partition, as martyrs. And they remember their death as sacrifice. But that's kind of just positioning what I've done. Yeah.
But let's start with how did these parts of India where these migrants were coming in, how did they start viewing the migrants? Right, they started coming in from the 30s and 40s and went on till early 50s, So how did these people think they were being seen? And what did these people then wanted to show?
By
The
these
Sharanarthi and the Purusharth.
by these people, you mean partition survivors,
Yeah, the
right?
survivors, yeah.
So when they came to North India, partition survivors were seen as refugees, but they were also not exactly welcome. It's so at least that's how partition survivors remember this, that they did not feel that they were welcome, or that they were treated very nicely. But that's also a reflection on what the experience of the partition meant to them, which is that it is felt as this, as an event that takes their honor away, as an emasculating event. And so this sort of loss of dignity, of pride, is then expressed in narrative. Almost exactly a year to this day, not a year, but sorry, in 2017, it was actually on this very day, on 17th, the 18th of August, that I had my first conversation on this topic with a partition survivor that I spent a lot of time with. The pseudonym that I've given him in the book is Bhavrila, but like all other names in the book, it's a pseudonym. He was a very interesting guy, and so, we were meeting at his house on the 17th of August. It was just after Independence Day, and he was reflecting on this, and he said that, I feel that everything that the politicians say about independence and partition is just hollow. They don't know what it is. They haven't paid the price of freedom. So I said, tell me more. And he says, we have suffered and we have paid the price. When we came here, they used to call us Sharanarthi. Sharanarthi is... So Sharan means refuge. So Sharanarthi is someone who seeks refuge. So it says they used to call us Sharanarthi, refugees. But we were not Sharanarthi. We were not dependent on them. What did they do for us? We were Purusharthi. Now, what does Purusharth mean? In the canonical meaning of the term is actually quite different from how it was used routinely in conversation by partition survivors. The canonical meaning of the term relates closely to the sort of fourfold values of Hinduism. And it's essentially this idea that if you do your caste duty, it's related to the Varna Shram Dharma idea. And it's essentially that if you do your caste duty and you work virtuously, constantly and rigorously, then you will achieve moksha, salvation. It's a deeply sort of religious idea. But the way that they use Purusharth in conversation is very different. So Purusharth, to them, functions as hard work, as even cleverness. So when he said that we weren't Sharanarthi, we are Purusharthi, he then went on to tell me about how partition survivors did everything from...
The guy who would drive the rickshaw in the night in Ambala.
That's a different person, yeah. But yeah, that's another example.
Same example. So
exactly, yeah. So, other examples that I got were someone who used to drive a rickshaw at night, and this is while he was about 13, 14 years old, and he was in school, and he used to pay his school fees by driving the rickshaw for 2 nights in a week. And he used to do his homework sitting under a streetlight. And, those are the kind of stories that you hear about Purusharth. You hear about someone who's built 3 houses in Delhi by selling buttons on the street. You hear about others who sort of sold vegetables. And, it's these stories of Purusharth, as I call them in the book, are almost always stories of men hard at work, harsh physical labor, very dramatic stories of recovery. Yeah.
And all these stories are real. I mean, they're not making up fiction for it. I mean, these are the stories that North India has carried in its heart for many decades now. Grandfathers have done this, and then father also started. Grandfather gave a little better life to father. Father gave a better life to us. I mean, that's how the stories go. But where does privilege come in here? And why is it problematic?
So let's talk about the person who told me the story of how he used to drive a rickshaw at night, right? So what's interesting is that his family was in Ambala at the time in a refugee camp, but they were only there temporarily. They were waiting for their compensation claim to be processed, which, by the way, is that for people who owned property in Pakistan before the partition, they could claim property up to the value of 10,000 rupees in independent India. So even though he was driving a rickshaw for a limited period of time in his life, he was never at the same economic level as people who only drive a rickshaw as a source of living. And he only did this for 2 years. Once this compensation claim came in, they moved to the outskirts of Delhi, and life started afresh. And these are the sort of silences in these narratives that, yes, these are stories of hardship and hard work. But at the same time, refugees who'd owned property before the partition were never, ever at the same level as refugees who didn't have any property. And this is where caste comes in. Because scheduled caste and Dalit refugees had actually nothing. And they got nothing in the independent state. So if they were on the margins of society before the partition, they continued to be on the margins of society after the partition. And this is Ravinder Kaur's work, by the way.
Yeah, but you say that they are, at one level, the state reinforces the hierarchies of what was before partition.
Because it's land for land compensation.
Right.
So the state doesn't do anything to bridge the gap between the landed and the landless.
Right.
And that, I think, was a missed opportunity.
Yeah. Yes, of course. But the other side of it is that they also frown down on welfare schemes for the others. So this is becoming like this American dream. Like this. You work hard and you can make it big in the world. That's the view they have.
That's also because these stories of Purusharth function as what I call karmic justifications of wealth and status, which is that rather than mentioning compensation land and past wealth, they will talk about how they rode a rickshaw, for example, and that's how they rebuilt their lives. Like I'd mentioned that example of an uncle who sold buttons on the street and is said to have built 3 houses in Delhi by selling buttons. I mean, you can't build real estate by selling buttons on the street. We know this. If we could, I'd be selling buttons on the street, not writing a book. So it's that kind of thing. It's these absences. And really, this is the other thing with theodicy as well. If theodicy, on one side, rationalizes misfortune and suffering, it also provides a justification for good fortune. Right? Because then it says that if I have worked hard, I deserve what I have. And if they haven't, they're lazy. And we hear this a lot. And it's very neoliberal and American, like you said.
Yeah, I think the seeds of neoliberalism I found, they were lying in these stories that were already, amongst us in North India at least. But then how does theodicy link to sacrifice or martyrdom? That's another aspect of theodicy, because that again becomes a good death then in many ways.
So essentially, it goes back to that question of why is the partition so difficult to remember? It's because when you actually listen to these narratives deeply or engage with them deeply, you find that ultimately you're left with this question of why did this happen? What was the point of it all? Right? And this is felt most deeply by the people who actually had to go through this. What sacrifice does, what the narrative of sacrifice and martyrdom, what it does is it takes the uselessness out of the suffering. So it takes the ambiguity out of this whole experience and death. And what it actually says is that if my family died, that my family did not die an ambiguous death on the way to their new nation. They died an honorable death for the new nation. And it is this shift that then moves us explicitly towards this cultural turn towards Hinduism, towards Hindu nationalism. And what you find then, and what I encountered in the field, was people who would actually insist that we are not refugees. In fact, we have given sacrifices for this nation. we deserve the tag of freedom fighters. We are martyrs. My granduncle, that is my Nana's younger brother, in one conversation, and I've quoted this in the book, he says, we sacrificed so much, we had these big houses, we had so much land, etc. What do we get in return? Toote foote makan. And, behind this whole thing of sacrifice and martyrdom is also a very deep-seated resentment of why, like, you've done this to us, why? What do we get?
Yeah, and in this comes up that French term which you can say, I can't say.
I can teach you.
I tried thrice, I couldn't get it. But there is the construction of another. It's because of them that this happened to us. And that is where the politics plays out.
So the French term is right at the bottom there, the right-hand corner there, ressentiment. Ressentiment. It's French for resentment, but it's a little bit more. Ressentiment, in theoretical terms, ressentiment is what you get when you have an event that shatters your worldview, your nomos. When it actually shatters this view that you have of the world, a certain idea of humanity, a certain idea of society, a certain moral universe. And what you get in its wake then is this deep-seated resentment, this toxic jealousy that builds and builds and builds. It's fermented rage. And you can see it not just in the narratives of partition survivors who, as I argue in the book, have come to see justice and reparations for the partition as ethnic cleansing in the present, but also in the things that we see on TV today, like the bulldozer Raj, right? This is classic ressentiment. It's got an element of Schadenfreude to it, joy in the misery of others. If they suffer, that's good for me. That makes me feel better. That's the emotional register on which the partition is remembered.
And Purusharth also has a dimension of women, because that's where we started from earlier, because women are not acknowledged, So, and also of dignity versus destitution, because, so like the sewing machines, there's a big thing about sewing machines, and that's a very, very common trope in most of these stories. What did the women do? They had the sewing machine, they stitched clothes for the whole neighborhood, that kind of thing. But your informant emphasizes on, I don't do woman's work, I do the work of a darzi, she's doing a man's work. But, and the ones like who was in Doordarshan or who are teachers, they are recognized by society. But are they recognized inside home?
That depends. So I don't think they are recognized by society as much. I think it's the other way around. And what I mean by that is that when we were talking about Purusharth, for example, the men...
I meant like if somebody has a position in a government office, then that position is there. I mean, like you can't take it away from them.
You can't, but it will never... But will it be called Purusharth in the same sort of valorizing, moralizing discourse? That is what I mean by it's not recognized by society in the same way. Not that it's not recognized at all, of course, but not recognized in the same way. So the labor of men, for example, was valorized by men themselves as this is Purusharth. It sort of puts this virtuous gloss on it. It's not just hard work, it's Purusharth. It's something deeper, more virtuous. And women were almost absent from these stories. And that's when I kind of decided that I was going to, when I noticed this absence, I then started going back to the women that I had met in my fieldwork, and I said, what did you do during the partition? How did you manage for money? And it was also a reflection on the fact that I hadn't asked this question until then. It hadn't come up in conversation. They hadn't brought it up. But when I did, I actually uncovered these stories of women who, for example, I tell the story of Bhagwanti auntie who stayed in Tibia College, that refugee camp in Delhi with her mother-in-law, and it was just the two of them. Her husband hadn't been able to migrate yet. And they had no money, so what did they do? They used to knit. They used to knit a sweater every night. They used to stay up till 12, knit a sweater each, and they would go and give it to the shopkeeper who would give them, I think it was like a rupee. And that was what they had to manage with. A rupee every day for a sweater that was knit by staying up late in the night. And the funny thing is that, I mean, not the funny thing, but the interesting thing is that all through this experience, she loses a lot of weight. And then I also talk about this. And then after the partition is over, after her husband has come back and things have kind of normalized, she goes and meets her father, who was, I think, in Rohtak at the time. She goes and meets him, and the first thing he says is, oh, it looks like the bangle seller has come. And what he meant by that, he was trying to be funny, but what he's saying is that you've become so frail. You look like the bangle seller who comes in my street. So hard work and the effects of hard work on a woman's body are not valorized. There's something to be mocked. It's seen as a lowering of her status.
There is one more aspect of these partition narratives, and that is, and this is I'm saying from my location, because I'm sitting here, so I can also say, from being born in a Sikh family, the narrative that we have heard is, oh, the Sikhs were the violent ones. All the killings were done by the Sikhs, really, And I, for a few years of my life, I actually received it. I said, okay, we are the violent ones. Later I learned that, okay, the British called us the martial race, and then there is this sword in our homes all the time, But then 1984 happens. And these non-violent ones turn violent. And this time it is we who are suffering, So and I'm glad I read it in the book. I mean, the way Pranav then explains it, that how the dirty work was done by others. That is also part of Purusharth, So.
Yeah, so it's what I call the othering of violence, which is that it's a way of denying the violence of your own community. It wasn't us, they did it. And I heard this sentence a lot, Sikhon ka zyada jhagda tha. The Sikhs had a bigger fight with them. They were the ones who were doing it. We were just running away. We're meek. We don't do anything. And really at the heart of it, it is a denial of the violence of one's own community. And I realize now I never actually answered that question about the hermeneutics of suspicion. So what is that? It's deeply ingrained in anthropology, and this is why we do participant observation, which is that at its simplest, it is that words do not always mean what they seem to mean, right? And it's a very simple idea. It's like if I ask you how you're doing and you say, I'm fine, you're not obviously fine. And I am going to dig deeper. When I do that, I am practicing the hermeneutics of suspicion. The reason anthropologists do participant observation, the reason I did long-term fieldwork, was because I wanted to see how people's beliefs and actions matched up with the words that I was hearing. To talk to others in their community, to see how truthful these stories are. What were the silences? What are the absences? Like the absence of women from the stories of Purusharth. So that's one strand. We're going to park that to the side. But to come back to that question, the one sort of big moment that actually brings out the ways in which Sikhs are racialized was this conversation that I had with these two partition survivor uncles in 2018. I think it was like March 2018. And this was a conversation where they actually say things like Sikhs are as untrustworthy as Muslims. And it is this construction of another race and another people. But at the same time, they also expect Sikhs to acknowledge the fact that they are just Hindus with a turban. And there is this hierarchization of how they see Hindus. And the othering of violence is part of it. And it is really, like you said, the continuance of that colonial rhetoric or that colonial construction of Sikhs as a martial race. And you actually find a lot of similarity in this idea of the martial race between how British anthropologists saw Sikhs and how they saw Pathans. Very similar construction, right? So what is the stereotype? It's hot-blooded, quick-tempered, short-tempered, and a simpleton. The construction is almost exactly the same. So yeah, have I answered your question?
No, and I mean, like just yesterday, day before, I mean, the two religious people in this whole country who asked for, remembrance of partition and the betterment of the entire humanity were the Jathedars of Shri Akal Takht and Shri Damdama Sahib. And these were Sikh. Nobody else seems to remember partition. And nobody else seems to, even, if you look at the great prime ministerial talk that happened, nothing, no mention. In fact, there was no mention of freedom fighters also in that now. The thing is changing so much, And it's all based on this othering of other, like violence, those people. Bad, those people. And our narrative, our thing is all pristine, pure hard work, And this is what I find very, very problematic,
There's another thing I want to mention, actually. Part of the reason I had these conversations about Sikhs with my informants was also because Urvashi Bhattalia in her book, The Other Side of Silence, talks about how 1984 reopened the barely healed wounds of 1947. So for Sikh families who were living in Delhi who sort of witnessed it and were victims of this violence, it was like the partition come again, but at a time and a place where no one ever thought this was going to happen to them. And I wanted to actually talk to people on the other side of this. How do Hindus see it? And how does this generation of people that has actually seen the partition, how do they see 1984? Do they feel solidarity? Do they empathize? And the answer, sadly, was not really. And there is that conversation in the book.
Yeah. No, but there is also this in Gangaram from Miyawali and Puran Chand from Bannu, there is also this, you gave a whole chapter to them because at one level they are so driven to retain connections with Pakistan, one through personal visits and other through newspaper and newspaper article and all that, But at the same time, another part of their own heart is so given into the propaganda of the times, So to you, this was contradiction, and I accept that. But to me, it was...
It wasn't actually.
Yeah, okay. So to me, it was, this is how people are. Yeah.
So I construct a straw. When I say that this was a contradiction in terms at the end of that chapter, I'm actually constructing a straw man. And there's a reason for that, which is that in a lot of oral history narratives that I've read, nostalgia for the pre-partition period is often presented in these very simplistic and romanticized terms as the absence of hatred after the partition. So the usual story goes, oh, look at this person remembering the partition. They have such fond memories. They remember the house they were in. They remember their Muslim neighbors. This is so great. We may be living in different countries now, but isn't it so great that we can remember this and move on? No, that's what I'm trying to show. I'm not actually saying that's a contradiction. It's not. It's totally not. It's the complexity of being a person and going through a difficult experience like that and carrying that emotional baggage.
Yeah, but to me, this is just trauma response. This is how I have looked at North India. This land has been in trauma for 3,000 years. 3,000 years when South India was developing, North India was just being invaded, attacked. Religions were changing, people were changing, everything was changing. To me, I've always seen it with that eye, but I know you have to be clinical about what you're saying, but it's interesting.
But there's another thing that I want to say about this idea of 3,000 years of trauma, which is, and this is, I think, the one small point where we disagree, which is that when you talk about 3,000 years of societal trauma, you're actually using trauma as a metaphor, not as a clinical term. And that, as I've said in my introduction, is not how I use the term. Because I'm actually quite wary of how loaded a word trauma has become and how deeply enmeshed it is with a certain politics of victimhood, of these claims to victimhood that are then used to legitimize one's own violence in the present. So we are victims. What we are doing is not violence. This is justice. That's the sort of shift of narrative. So for me, what I see when I hear you talk about 3,000 years of trauma is actually a certain victimhood complex.
Fine. I'm deliberately throwing words so that you can beat me up. you know. But no, but at least Porus is 2,000 years, Alexander Porus, and it goes. And actually, Central Asia has been coming in. That's what I argue in my thing, that Punjab, the whole region was the gate for the gateway called subcontinent. You know, so the gate story is different. It is more complex. You know, but. So what do you propose? I mean, how do we get out of, or how do we start looking at partitions? What is your idea for it? You know.
That's a big question, and I don't think there's like an answer that. I don't think there's a ready answer I can give, but I can tell you what I tried to do, which is that in remembering the partition in the 21st century, what I tried to do was be incredibly wary of the weaponization of this memory. I don't want these memories to be used to justify violence in the present. If you're interested in using the memory of the partition to exact revenge, I don't want to talk to you. And
I don't want to talk to you is another partition.
well, not in a scholarly way, but yeah, it's. So I guess for me, how we remember the partition going forward, especially now that almost all the people that I spoke to for this book are dead. Only my granduncle is still around. You know, everyone else passed away. A lot of them passed away during COVID. And I think now that we've sort of moved into a different phase of the history of the partition, which is that it can't be said to be a living memory anymore. It's practically not living memory. No, it's now sort of moving into this to a sort of historical memory. We need to be incredibly wary of how we remember the partition.
No, but like in your conclusion, you so vehemently argue about the anti-CAA law, you know, like and what happened there, and you are foreboding another partition. So what's your response to that?
What I was trying to do there, so for most of the book, what I've done is observe how the present affects how we remember the past. When I talk about the CAA and I talk about how the afterlife of the partition animates this law and this kind of politics, what I'm trying to do is observe the partition in the present. And yeah, I mean, I don't actually have an answer to your original question.
No, but have we learned any lessons?
Have we learned any lessons? As a society, I don't think we have. I mean, I think we're on course to repeat the mistakes of the past, sadly, right now. What do you think?
So you dedicate your book to Nani and Anbu, your godson. Nani, I understand. She anchored you. She gave you the space. But what would you tell Anbu then?
So Anbu is 3 right now. So fortunately, I have some time before I figure out the answer. But the reason I made this intergenerational link of like, for Nani, who carried the burden of a difficult past, and for Anbu in the hope of an unburdened future, what I'm trying to do there is also acknowledge the fact that in many ways, by doing this research, I've become the link between these generations that never met. And so I hope that when Anbu is older, and when my nieces and nephews are older, they will come and ask me about this history, because I would love to tell them about it. But I also hope that they grow up at a time when remembering this history is not fraught with the politics of the present.
Thank you.
I'm second generation after the partition. My parents came here during the partition. And I just wanted to know that in your research, did you come across any kind of logic for the Radcliffe Line? Because to my mind, I can't come up with any kind of logic for why Sindh was not divided. Unlike West Bengal, East Bengal, and you had even Punjab was also divided, and there was some place for Hindus and Muslims. Sindh, we were just completely displaced. And it's actually a very pathetic situation because we really haven't been able to hold on to our culture. We haven't been able to hold on to our language. And we are just sort of merging with wherever we've actually chosen to actually come and settle here. So we've actually kind of slowly losing our identity, which is really a sad state of affairs. So have you come across any kind of logic? Why the hell did he do something like that?
My answer is going to be disappointing. I actually wasn't looking at the high politics of the partition. I was more concerned with recording these stories before time ran out. So it was really driven by this existential urgency of here is a generation that is passing away, and I had people who passed away while I was doing fieldwork. So it was really driven by this very existential urgency of let's record these stories before it becomes impossible. And I deeply feel for the experience of Sindh, and it's always been enigmatic to me that it's in our national anthem, but
Yes.
it's completely sort of marginal even in partition studies. So I don't know what else to say except that I empathize.
No, it's
Sad
it's,
state
it's
of
not
affairs.
only a loss of space, but loss of culture, loss of language, loss of,
That's what I mean.
and it is in some ways it is Acharya Kripalani versus L.K. Advani kind of politics going on there,
Yeah.
But I think for Radcliffe Line and whatever I have read, I have not found any logic. I mean, that's exactly the
Yeah,
problem.
there's no
with
logic
partition.
because I think there's an area called Thal Parker, which was right contiguous to Rajasthan, and it was predominantly Hindu, and
Yeah.
it could have been
Yeah.
sort of given to the Hindus, but
Right.
that also didn't
Yeah,
happen. Yeah.
And we were speaking of theodicy earlier, but this is again one of those theodistical questions that come up. Why did X area go over there? Why did we have to suffer the partition? Why did this happen to us? Why? And the same question is asked about various villages and towns, even in Punjab. That like my granduncle insists that in Dera Ghazi Khan, the population of Hindus and Muslims are roughly equal. So we should have been on this side of the border. Why weren't we on this side of the border? And you hear this from other people from other cities and towns as well. And sadly, there is no answer.
And really, from what I understand, I think there's a lot more Sindhi spoken now in Pakistan than there is in all of India, and it's unfortunate. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, thanks for this wonderful discussion. And of course, I'm looking forward to reading the book. Well, I actually have like too many questions, but I'll just limit myself to probably just one. There's a huge difference I am born and brought up in South India. And when you travel, I worked in Delhi as well. There's a huge difference. Let me share the point of view that I want to see the book from. As a citizen right now, concerned citizen, as you want to call it, or as an activist or a politician, the problem of othering and what really, why is that we haven't really, learned from partition? And also the difference, in what I really see over here and the conversations I see up north as well.
So that question of why haven't humans ever gotten over othering, it's a much larger anthropological question. And the difference really is, the reason really is that we can see difference. So even when you talk about the partition and why we haven't ever gotten over it, it's because in a very real sense, people can see racial and ethnic difference. So how do you convince people that these boundaries are imagined, or that the difference between us, even if it is just about the difference in the faiths that we follow, still makes us human beings? How do you convince people that there is no difference between us when they can actually see difference? That's the problem.
No, as we try to show in the talk or in what Pranav shows in the book, it's also in how we have told our stories. No? How our stories have been so full of masculinity, about bravado, about hard work, that we ended up constructing a narrative like that in which there are those people and there are we people. That's the problem. That's exactly the problem.
Yeah, because it's not just a physical partition, right? There's so much partition really happening in our own minds as well right now, which is, I feel, I don't know, is there really no going back?
No, I really feel it is just North India snowballing into South India, It should not be happening. I mean, all the trauma from there or all the ideas from there or all the victimhood narratives from there are just being dumped onto South India, and now South India is also becoming like that. It's we who are bringing it here. I mean, that's my reason to agree to the talk, to come here and do the talk.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So, some years ago, we had an article to be published by the Cambridge University Press, and they objected strongly to the idea of South India. Okay, they said it is Southern India. You call it South India and it becomes a separate nation. Otherwise, it is Northern India and Southern India because India is one. And you never, ever use the word South India, North India in political debate or in a journal, ever. And this is a very specific comment from Cambridge University Press, and we have not used the word South India, North India ever again. It harbingers a partition, which need not occur if you keep on harping on North India, South India. The violence of the partition occurred in Bangalore. Gandhi devoted an entire prayer session, upset by the fact that the fire of the communal violence had reached even a city like Bangalore, which was not even in India at that point of time. It was in Mysore Kingdom. So the fact that there is a difference between Northern India and Southern India, and the Southern India is somehow immune to it, is completely false. The Indian Institute of Science had a faculty called Professor Sastry, who was a sociology and psychology professor, who was asked to advise the government of India on how to reduce the violence. So from an academic perspective, from a social perspective, the books that were recommended for the newly established Tata Institute of Social Science and Psychology Department in MHANS included issues of mob violence, on how to tackle issues of fascism, on how to tackle issues of group psychology, and things like that. So the fact that the violence had its repercussions in every part of India is quite real. It is not confined to one place. The problem is that in most of our victimhood, and this is why are there no biographical studies of this kind from Pakistan? Why hasn't there been an epidemic of autobiographical writing of the partition from Pakistan? Now, the first time we held a session on this was actually in Pakistan, and we found it very difficult because they see this as a validation for the existence of the nation of Pakistan. What we are seeing as a cutting off of India is their validation. So they cannot accept guilt for that, in that sense, in an administrative sense. On a one-to-one, we could hold a seminar off a formal forum, which went on for 4 hours, but we could not formally present it as a designated seminar. We could do it only informally, much like what happened at the ISC yesterday. There could be no formal acceptance of Setalwad, but she could hold an informal seminar. So these kinds of issues, and the issue is that these kinds of lazy tropes of the clever Punjabi Baniya and the clever Kayasts of North India and the incredible business acumen of the Punjabi Khatri clans and the incredible valor of the Sikh, these are all 19th century tropes. Okay, so let's accept of that. The fact that in the Holocaust and the other violence of Europe, we could derive a universal Declaration of Human Rights. We could derive in Western discourse a complete separation of the state and religion, officially. It may exist at various levels, but in India, we were so caught up in this 18th century ideas of religiosity because we refused to accept modernity. And that is a problem in India, that we refuse to be modern. And that has been a critique of the colonial power then and continues to be even now, because our powers are as colonial as the British were. They insist on a divide and rule, much the same as we claim the British. But on a personal note, writing all this, what was your feeling of Dublin between the Catholic and Protestants? Are those historical partitions a mirror, and how they have converted those into a much more reasonable way of being and a uniform sense of civic sense? How is that? Do you anticipate a unification like Northern Ireland and Ireland, a redoing of the partition?
So, Dublin doesn't feel like a partition city in the way that Delhi feels like a partition city, in the way that the afterlife is far more visceral. The other thing about reunification, I think the Republic of Ireland, I mean, a lot of people actually don't want reunification for purely economic reasons, which is that they see the 6 counties up north as an economic burden because the economy is heavily sustained by British government grants. So, you know, but if you're talking about it on the level of sectarianism, I think you feel it more, I've been told. I've never been to Northern Ireland, but I've heard that you feel sectarianism more in the sort of sense of everyday personal relations, more in Northern Ireland than in Southern Ireland. I think Southern Ireland's political proximity to Europe and also its the Catholic Church's fall from grace has actually really changed the dynamics of society. It doesn't have that Catholic nationalist identity, which sort of exacerbates this whole problem. It is well and truly a secular, liberal democracy, even if it is a Catholic majority country, and a Catholic majority country where people still practice Catholicism. But that Catholic nationalist identity is gone now.
So, given the fact that India and Ireland share almost the same flag at 90 degrees.
Yeah, they do.
Exactly the same flag.
Yeah.
And Basil de Oliveira and Gandhi were close associates. Where do you think the deviation occurred between Irish notion of liberal secular democracy and the Indian notion, which is now a notion only in name?
So I think secularism means different things in Europe and India. In India, secularism is understood as a sort of peaceful coexistence of multiple religions. So if I am reading the namaz beside someone who is offering Navratri prayers, that is an example of secularism for us. In Europe, and this is true for Ireland as well, secularism is the absence of public displays of faith and religion. It is the absence of religion from public life, from political office. And I think that is a pretty big difference in the understanding of what secularism means. So that is, I think, the root of the deviation. And of course, then they take different routes.
Good evening.
Good evening.
My question is how the class and caste narratives have changed in terms of sociology after partition.
Could you just explain that question to me a little further? What do you mean how they've changed sociologically?
I just wanted to know about that, how sociologically caste and religion. Caste and religion system. How these narratives have changed after partition and after getting freedom. Pre-partition. What is the difference between this pre-partition and post-partition related to caste and religion?
So you mean like social harmony,
Yeah.
in a sense? Okay. I think I understand your question. So I think what you're trying to say is, what were inter-community relations before partition and how did they change after partition, right? That's the heart of the question. So the master's dissertation that I was talking about, which was the sort of the baby that inspired this book, that actually looked at denial and nostalgia within pre-partition narratives. So it was basically looking at that question of what were inter-community relations like before the partition, and the answer is that they weren't perfect. If what you're trying to ask me is, did communalism exist before the partition? It did. That's why we had the partition. And another thing that you find in sort of pre-partition narratives from the late 30s and the 40s, and I believe this goes further back as well, is that upper caste Hindus practiced untouchability against Muslims. So, things like they would not eat food cooked by Muslims. If the Muslim workers on their farms picked the vegetables, they would take raw vegetables from them and cook them themselves. Separate vessels, separate water containers, all of those things. So in one sense, it was like segregation almost, right? In these kind of things. But again, there was a class divide there. So if you had a rich Muslim neighbor, you might eat with them. Some families would. But if you're talking about poor Muslims and an upper caste Hindu, then you would find untouchability there. So I don't know if that answers your question, but the heart of it is that things were not perfect before the partition.
No, let me just add, because there's one question we missed because of time thing, and it's the very first chapter of the book, actually, where he sets up the space where he will do his research. I'm sorry I'm answering for you, but I think I should add it here, because Delhi, where his research is, on one of the cities in the NCR region, Faridabad, Delhi changed dramatically in 1947. Pre-partition, the Delhi's population was 7 lakh, and post-partition it became 12 lakh. And almost all the influx was Hindus and Sikhs. And as he says beautifully in the book, in that chapter, like Delhi was such a Muslim city before 1947, but after 47 it became more of a Hindu and a little bit of a Sikh city.
It was the world's Urdu cultural capital, before partition. And there's a lot of heritage that Delhi lost in the partition. And when you talk about the influx of population as well, we have to keep in mind that the pre-partition population of 7 lakhs that we're talking about, there were actually a number of Delhi's own residents, Muslim residents, who left Delhi. And then it shot up to 12 lakhs with the influx of refugees. So actually the proportion of refugees is not 5 lakhs, it's much more than that. Because there's a number of people who've left the city, and still the population has continued to grow. The other thing that happens to the geography of Delhi, and you've been to Delhi several times and you can confirm this as well, is that Delhi has become a more ghettoized city over time. There are religiously segregated residential communities. And this is one of the ways in which the geography of Indian cities has changed post-independence. They have increasingly become ghettoized, segregated cities. Some worse than others, but we can all speak for that even in Bangalore, right? We have an intimate idea of which community lives in which part of town, and that's a sign of ghettoization and segregation.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Dr. Pranav, I welcome and celebrate your coming of your book.
Thank you.
And we have really enjoyed reading the first part of the book. And you have been so eloquent in explaining the nonsense of writing this book as your PhD was going on, your experiences on the field. Right. The question that comes to my mind is that has the bane of partition ended? Has the bane of participation ended after the so-called participation, we call it as post-1947? Because the moment what we call as the free India we celebrate every year, things started happening. Reorganization of states on linguistic basis, reorganization of states based on water, reorganization of states based on deposits and minerals, right, and agriculture. So what has happened? 3 words come to my mind as far as the partition is concerned. I was just writing them. fracturing of the country. Second, fragmentation of society. Third, alienation of communities. I think we see all these things in your book? If I were to read your book more and more, I see that you have written your book in such a way that we are going to see this more in future.
Okay, so my answer is a little bit of a cop-out.
Yes.
I'm just going to read a section from the
Sure.
book that I think corresponds well with
That's how
what
a
you
teacher
asked.
figures out his student, like that's what happens.
Just give me a second.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, so, about this whole idea of whether there's any, I think the heart of your question is whether there's any healing from the partition, whether you can ever come back from something like the partition. I'm going to read out the last bit of chapter 8, which is about one of the people I was really close to during my fieldwork. I gave him the name Puran Chand, which the backstory is that that was actually my great-great-grandfather's name. So I've kind of bequeathed a familial name to a person I was very fond of in my fieldwork. This is about the last time I met him, and I've just written about this. This is on page 271, if anyone wants to read with me. It's the last paragraph. So here goes. However, my most enduring memory of Puran Chand is of a conversation we had in February 2018. We were taking a half round of the Rose Garden together when he unexpectedly remarked, and I quote, "My life, to tell you the truth, there is a sadness. All this that happened, I had become a sadist then." End quote. Although he used the word sadist, what he actually meant to say was sad or depressed. He explained that in the years immediately following the partition, looking at how life was like here, he had become depressed. There's another quote here. "I was just sad, never really laughed fully," he said. When I asked him whether it was a partition that had caused this, kind of an obvious question, he nodded and said, and I quote, "One does get affected. Once that leaves an imprint, it becomes difficult. After that, I became a secluded, separate, silent type. Even now, I don't talk much. Even today, I don't speak a lot. So all these things, just gloomy type," end quote. He let those words hang momentarily. When I encouraged him to go on, he said, and I quote, "When someone's smile is not natural, and you see that it is not natural, mine was just like that. I would see others and do the same, but it was not the same. My mind got affected now," end quote. I had noticed his somber disposition. I had seen his weak smiles, and had heard his half-hearted laughter. And even though he had bared his heart to me, none of that alleviated the melancholy he observed in himself. I do not think anything could. Some ruptures are beyond healing.
Yeah.
So,
I think it answers my question. Thank you.
thank you.
Very good evening.
2
And
minutes, 1 minute, how much time do we have?
Good evening.
this is a very
Let me just ask Willem. Yeah.
so a short question.
Quickly.
We talked about no logic for the boundary for the partition. The question is, why did we choose to accept it? And if we could have done something where we could have made it easier for most, if that was a possibility. Why did we choose to accept
No,
it?
we didn't choose. I mean, it just happened. I mean, the two countries were too busy celebrating freedom and people were suffering on the ground. I mean, Nehru, before he started his Tryst with Destiny speech, it's there in the Dominic Lapierre's novel, no? He gets a telegram about how many killed in the trains, but he has to give that speech as well. I mean, what do you do? The Radcliffe Line itself came 2 days later. So it came today on 17th. Pakistan got free on 14th. India got free on 15th. The line came later. But people there was chaos, there was fear, there was killing happening everywhere. So we didn't choose it. It was foisted on us.
So it was fostered, and after that, once we had the freedom, have there been done something about it to
A lot.
accommodate?
A lot could have been done. Those who were in the know, even the leaders who had been negotiating since God knows when, like the early 1930s about all this, they always thought it would be a peaceful migration of people. Nobody imagined that it would be bloodshed like this. Neither Jinnah nor Nehru, of course not Gandhi, nor Patel, none of them. It was...
I want to read a quote from my granduncle, which actually answers this question as well. And I think it's appropriate that he answers it. This is a quote, okay? Page 137. Did you ask the population what is to be done and what not? Democracy was not there at the time. We call it a democracy now. Now when something happens, so then they ask, Bhai, put it to the public. What do the people want? What was it then? Back then, everyone was after their own seat. Everyone only talks about the sacrifices of Pandit Nehru. Are their sacrifices? Are our sacrifices less than our entire property? Our hard-earned ancestral property that we left behind? And what do we get in compensation? Broken houses where we had mansions? So it made a big difference. So that's how the people who actually suffered the partition actually feel about it. They didn't have a choice. And they didn't accept it.
But let me also say something I just recently read, and this, I remember even father telling me once, during partition, while Nehru was visiting all these places, a woman went and grabbed his collar, says, what is democracy? What is India? And he says, the right for you to be able to hold my collar. Which we can't see anywhere now, anywhere. Milan, sorry, please come, because otherwise...
No, actually, that would have been the perfect note to end it on, what you just said. So I'm just, coming back to the title on the book, which is, memories of, the Hindu thing. So I just to give context to my background, I have parents who are both, my parents and grandparents are, people who have lived through partition, and I've grown up with it. Mom having her, been a kid, and the parents having moved from Karachi to Bombay and then to Hyderabad and so on. Dad's side, Lahore, Delhi, refugee camps, all of it. And I also observed the differences between their experiences, which were, very close to 1947, just a little before, just a little after, with the experiences of the family that I married into. This was the Sindhis and then the Punjabis, which was, much earlier. So it, as you started off by saying that the process had begun, post 1935, and for people who saw it coming, it was all happening in bits and pieces. And so therefore, this whole thing of, the whole martyr sort of thing that you aligned with, my question is, did you see any correlation between people who moved at what point in time? Because I saw a very high buy-in between, the Punjabis in the family who moved much earlier, bought into the freedom struggle. There's a whole, lot of them who are freedom fighters and all of that. And the Sindhi side of the family, all of whom I could resonate with every single thing that you talked about, the compensation. There's still a family home in Karachi, which has become a, declared monument, not to be touched, all of it. But then you got, Chithade for compensation. But I didn't see any time them buying into this whole Hindu state concept that you talked about. So I was wondering about the timing, and did you research that at any point in time?
So the vast majority of the people that I spoke to actually came in 47 and was sort of affected by the violence. There was one uncle that I met in Delhi, and he's only in the book for a brief bit. His family came in 1942. And he was in Delhi during the partition, and he talks about the violence he saw in Karol Bagh, which is where he was living at the time. And he had also bought into this. But again, for context, he was a member of the RSS until well, he became almost bedridden. So I think the correlation is more in terms of a larger cultural linguistic shift to living in North India and accepting the Hindu nation I think there's a larger shift there. Even the use of the word Purusharth, for example, which is a Sanskrit word, is a dramatic shift away from their own mother tongues, Punjabi and Urdu. So there's a larger cultural shift that that I could see, and I sort of what's the word? I explicitly discuss it in the conclusion. But when you compare this against ethnographies that were written in the late 90s, like Urvashi Batalia, Ritu Menon, Kamla Bhasin, and then others that were sort of in 2007, etc. The sacrifice thing isn't as pronounced. There is a shift that has happened, and a shift where a particular way of seeing the nation and imagining religious community has sort of dramatically come to the fore, like we were saying at the beginning, where it's come out from these hushed whispers to the loudspeaker.
I think that's
Thank you
the
for that.
perfect note to end the
Yeah.
talk. My only request is, and I'm saying this because I won't ask you to buy the book, I'll ask you to read the book. Buying is a process of it, because as a writer, I know many buy, few read reviews, and they come and tell me, it's, I get it, So I'm just saying, read the book and talk about it to friends. It will never come on WhatsApp, but I hope it travels otherwise. Thank you. Thank you for being with us.
And thank you for coming.